Go. Hello, we are live, and yeah, it's kind of fun. I haven't done a whole lot of these live chats in a little while. Used to do a lot of this stuff with the podcast, but maybe one day again. So yeah, my name is Kent, and I'm here with Jack, my friend.
Hey.
And yeah, hi. And we're going to be talking about testing. Jack and I have slightly different views on testing React specifically. And so Josh suggested, what's Josh's last name? I should have had this up. But this guy, Josh, he's a nice person. I met him at Chain React. But he suggested that Jack and I chat about our different views on testing and see if we can make it answer any questions, or I don't know, come to a consensus or whatever. so yeah, this is live, and it looks like there are a grand total of 7 people watching. They're streaming in. So
we've made it.
Yeah, we have 9. It keeps coming up.
Need double digits.
Yeah, there it is, 12. Anyway, so we're gonna I'll keep the chat open, and so we can just keep track of things. And if you do have any questions about whatever, then we can answer your questions. And yeah, but pretty much we're planning on just kind of talking about our own testing philosophies and how they are different, how they're the same, and how we can sleep at night with our testing philosophies. Okay, I'm done joking. Let's go ahead and talk. So do you want to start us off, Jack, on your own testing philosophy?
Yeah, sure. Let's give this a go. So I guess I come at testing React from so I used to be a backend developer. I never wrote any JavaScript for a good couple of years at my jobs. And so I think probably the testing methodology I've come from, and I'm sure we'll get onto like shallow versus mounted testing and all the rest of it, probably stems more from that background and the idea of writing a lot of unit tests in isolation from one another. So I think that's really the main thing when I'm writing unit tests in particular is how to keep things isolated. I guess another thing it's worth saying is when it comes to testing React is I'd really rather test as little React as possible. And move most logic that I want to test outside of React components and keep my component tests slim, which is probably another reason maybe that I lean more towards the shallow rendering side. I'm not too sure. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, obviously. So yeah, I've always tried to write quite, I guess, almost strict unit tests and keep them fairly close to the ideal standard or definition of what a unit test is. Within reason, and I think I try to apply that to my React tests as well. Not always successfully. It doesn't always quite work, but I guess it's like my very high level approach. I'm sure we can dive into details in a bit as we go.
Yeah, cool. So what about integration or end-to-end tests? Do you do any of that, or do you rely on unit tests?
So currently, at the current where I'm working at the moment at a company called Thread, we don't have any end-to-end tests. This is more due to previous experience with what was it called, the Angular framework that isn't just Angular. Protractor. Yes, we wrote that, and actually, to be fair, Protractor as a framework was good, but its tests were very flaky, and I think that's more down to like those type of Selenium end-to-end tests are always flaky. They failed a lot. It was hard to know if they were failing legitimately or if they were failing just because they fail sometimes. And so I've not really been too keen to ever work with that stack again. That said, Ken, I know you've written a lot of Cypress tests, Cypress.io. It's like high on my list of things to try soon, but haven't quite got there yet. So I think if we could have a technology that made those tests as easy to write and work with as unit tests, then I would be 100% writing a lot of them. Just haven't quite had the chance to play with that yet.
Yeah, I think you'll be really happy with Cypress. It is exactly what you're looking for, I think.
Great.
Awesome. So yeah, for me, testing is a mechanism for confidence. And so my goal when I'm testing is to be confident that I can ship my application, that it works in the way that I want. And I think we share that. Oh, here's Peter Cooper coming in. Hey, 2 of my favorite JavaScript dreamboats in one place. Oh, Peter, you're great. So when I ship my code, I want my test to run and verify that things are working as like that when the user uses my application, that it's going to work. And so the distinction between unit integration and end-to-end tests is less important to me. And the real metric I care about is confidence. And it's kind of like not a quantitative, but more of a qualitative measure. And so there's a lot less science and a lot more art, I guess, with that. But the general idea is if I want to verify that, like to verify when a user is using the application that it's going to work, then I'm going to write my tests in a way that resemble the way that my application is going to be used. Because if I don't do that, then I really can't verify that it's going to be that my application will work when the user uses it. So where that actually applies is my like whether I'm doing a really low level test for a component or a higher level test for an application, I'm going to interact with that slice of the application in the same way a user of that component would. And in the context of unit testing components, you actually have two users. You have the end user who clicks on buttons and looks for form fields and fills those out. And then you have the developer user who's going to be rendering that component using the props and having callbacks and things. And so when I'm writing my tests, that's how I'm thinking about it, is like completely like it's very much like this black box testing where I can't see inside what's going on. So I don't care anything about implementation details. And I interact with it in the same way that a user would. And that's my goal when I'm testing. And that kind of drives my philosophy. That's where React testing library came out. And so I'm a fan of unit testing, but I may define it a little differently, where unit testing would presume to say, like, we don't care about React itself. We don't even want to use React necessarily. Like rendering to the DOM. Some people interpret that to be an integration test to actually render it to the DOM. Now we're integrating with React. And I don't really care about that distinction. I'm mostly interested in making sure that my application will work when the user uses it. And when the user uses it, it is rendered into the DOM. And so that's why that's what I want to do. So anyway, that's kind of my philosophy. I definitely do integration tests, and my unit and integration tests are kind of meshed in. Normally, I try to test higher level components that are like higher up my tree and use multiple of my other smaller components. And then if my smaller component has a couple edge cases, then I'll write a couple unit tests for those. And then I'll have some tests that are like an entire page. I'll render, like still using JS DOM and everything. I'll render the whole page and click around and make some interactions. Those tend to be bigger tests with more assertions. And then I'll have some, the ideal is to have some Cypress tests as well to have some happy path tests for the full application running. And yeah, that's my philosophy.
Yeah, and I think we're quite aligned on nearly all of that stuff. One thing I forgot to say, which I really want to say, which you've touched on, is I think with React, and so I use Enzyme. I know you've moved on to your own library, React testing library. That I feel like the lines between unit and integration tests have got a lot blurrier in this testing front end React world. I think often what you could call a unit test, and that it renders a React component, you click a button and it does this thing. Like some people, I could be argued that is an integration test in some form. So I think really what we probably have, at least my apps tend to have a bunch of unit tests, whereas some of those are probably closer to integration tests. But I think similar to you, I don't really draw a distinction between them. I'm not sure how useful that is. I think I just have unit tests and then an idea, well, this Cypress end-to-end or acceptance tests. And that's kind of it. I think that the unit integration test line is blurry in this world.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think where you can draw a hard line is if you do any shallow rendering, then those I don't think you could consider those anything but unit tests, because it's impossible to integrate with anything. Like it won't render anything else. So yeah, there are a couple of questions here in the chat we can address, and then we can talk about some specifics of different ways to test things. So
yeah, sounds good. I can't actually see the chat, by the way, so I'll
oh
let you do the admin. I don't know how I get it.
yeah,
It's just not appeared.
yeah, it doesn't show up in the Hangout, which I think is kind of odd. But if you go to the YouTube video, you can see it there.
Right. I'll go
Make
watch
sure
myself on YouTube.
to stop the video.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
So coding it wrong, which is Josh, whose name I can't remember his last name. Sorry, Josh. But he's saying, do either of you do much test-driven development? Are you mostly testing after? So I'll answer first. I don't do a ton of test-driven development, but I do occasionally. I've had some mixed experiences with test-driven development. I have one library in particular that I don't want to mention, where I was 100% test-driven development, and I think I forgot the refactor phase because it is some of the worst code that I've written. I really don't like it, and I don't want to ever touch it again. So at the same time, I think one reason why the UI world has generally not done much TDD is because doing test-driven development with UI has been traditionally harder. But I've slowly been discovering that it actually is, with React testing library at least, it's not as hard as it once was, at least not for me. I'm going to look for one of my, I live stream week daily on some like dev tips. I call it Dev Tips with Kent. And a while back, I live streamed doing some test-driven development with React testing library, and I was really happy with that. So I think that TDD can be useful, and with the right tools, it can be actually like practical as well. So anyway, that's my answer. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, I think I'm mostly on the same page. I think where people fall down is people who, you as with most of the rules or guidelines or kind of things we have in tech, you can take the things too literally. And so I've seen people take TDD to mean every test has to be written first, which doesn't help me. I think the times where I really enjoy and find TDD really productive is mostly when I'm not doing UI, mostly if I'm just focusing on core business logic, for want of a much better term. I really don't like that phrase, but I will go with that. And when I know, like, okay, I'm going to call this function with these inputs and this is the output I'm going to get, I'm incredibly productive writing those tests first, watch them fail, working through the steps, going to red test to green test, and then enabling the refactor phase, which is my personal favorite, and having the confidence that you've not broken any of the logic just by refactoring is really nice. That's when I'm probably most productive as a programmer, to be honest. It's like head down, I know what I've got to build. For UI, I think I tend to lean towards building it first, or at least a little bit. I think I quite like getting something tangible working in the browser before I then look at what I need to test on it. But yeah, like you, I've been trying. I've actually got a thing on my list which says the next time I build a React component, I'm going to write the test first, just to fully test out that experience, if you pardon the pun. Where we'll because similar to you, I think it can be better. And I come from a Ruby on Rails background, and you could write what Rails would call feature specs there, where you write at a very high level. User goes to this page, fills in this field, hits button. And the workflow of writing that feature spec without any actual working UI and then filling it out as you like and working through the errors one by one was really nice. And I think with a good library that gives good errors, that can really guide you through the actual process of implementing that feature. So I guess in summary, like, everyone will have different preferences for when to test first and when to test after. I don't think it really matters too much. I find the more UI I do, the more I want to get that working in a browser before considering what to test. I think the thing I've fallen foul of before is thinking I know what the component has to do and writing tests for it, and then building the component and realizing that was completely the wrong tests. And if you don't know exactly what you're building, you're just wasting time writing the tests first. So sometimes 20 minutes hacking the component together in the browser will give you much more confidence in knowing what you want to test.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And to reiterate where TDD is really useful is, like, if you have a utility component that can take a variety of different inputs and it formats things or whatever and returns different outputs, like especially for the kinds of tests that you have, like an array of inputs and then an array of outputs, and you can iterate through those and have a bunch of tests like that. I love those kinds of utilities. These pure functions, they're very easy to TDD. But yeah, UI is a little tricky. So yeah, cool. Let's see. We've got a couple other questions coming in.
Spike and stabilize. I like that name for spiking a UI from Jamie Mason. That's a good term. I haven't heard that before, but that makes sense. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. That's good. Let's see. Okay, so somebody brought up shallow rendering and snapshot testing. We should definitely talk about that. Yeah, why don't we touch on that before we get to some of these other comments? So let's start with snapshots. What do you how do you feel about snapshot testing? Or actually, maybe we should describe that first for anyone unfamiliar. Do you want to describe that, Jack?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So in a snapshot test, what we do is you call a function. It can be a function, but I guess the person who's asked this question means more React component snapshots. So we'll probably roll with that. So what you do is you give the component certain set of props, and you basically take a snapshot of what the component gave you back when you called it with a certain set of props. And then every time the test then runs thereafter, it takes what the component's outputting and compares it to the snapshot, and it will alert you and fail the test if that snapshot has changed. So often that snapshot will have changed for legitimate reasons. Say if you snapshot the component and you've changed the CSS class name you're using or something like that, or the output, then your snapshot will legitimately have changed, and you can tell Jess to update your snapshot to the new version. Or it's a good way of alerting you if you've accidentally changed the output of something where you didn't. And if the snapshot changes, but you didn't think it should have, then you know you've introduced a bug or a change somewhere that you can hunt down. It's effectively a very quick way of testing what the component renders onto the page without writing a ton of assertions like it has a heading 2 with this class and a paragraph with this text. You just take one snapshot and that covers you fully. Is that a fair explanation?
Yeah. I think important things to call out is the snapshot is an actual file that you commit to your source control. And so when the test runs, if that file exists, then it's going to read that file and compare. And if it doesn't exist, then it'll write that file and then compare thereafter. And so I think it's another important distinction is that it really is just another assertion that can cover other more verbose assertions, I guess. But it's a really general assertion. And so if there's a span just hanging out nowhere in your component that's maybe irrelevant for your test, you're still making an assertion that span exists. And if you later remove that span, then your test is going to fail, even though it may have been irrelevant. So I feel like there's some trade-offs there. But anyway, I'm kind of getting into my opinions. And why don't you jump in with your opinions there, Jack?
So when snapshots first came out, I was very excited by them, and I kind of wrote loads and loads of them. I kind of shot up to the top of this big curve, and I think I'm coming down the other side now. I find them a very useful tool, but looking back, I think I overused them, and I wrote too many tests that were snapshot tests that effectively really hit upon the problem, Ken, that you just touched on, that would fail for almost irrelevant or not important details. Like, sure, I changed a wrapping span to a div. Like, that's fine. I did that. Just go away and leave me alone. So I think, especially as components get bigger, snapshotting bigger components mean there's more chance of that kind of irrelevant detail creeping in and causing a test failure. I think one characteristic of my tests that I really strive for is that they shouldn't be brittle. By brittle, I mean that a brittle test is one that just fails all the time because you change like some detail that it really isn't relevant to the assertion that test is covering. And I think snapshots can be quite an easy way to make brittle tests because they, as you said, they don't kind of hone in on a particular bit of detail. They just test the entire thing. And sometimes that's great, and on certain components, that's exactly what you want. And I find them a useful tool in my arsenal. But I think I fell into the trap using them too much, whereas actually I wanted a few for some of my smaller components, and then to test specific logic with almost normal tests, for want of a better phrase, in quotes, other than that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I've got more, but I'll pause.
No, you keep, yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'm very much the same. When I saw them at first, I was like, oh, this is the solution. Like, UI testing is always like, you're constantly changing things. Like I changed a div to a span. Now I got to update my test, whatever. And it's a lot of work. And so having a snapshot test that was easy to update, it was just awesome. Now I can actually test my UI in a way that doesn't really slow me down. And so, yeah, I kind of ended up with a lot of really big snapshots. I thought it was awesome. I felt like I was really confident. But then I found out that those kinds of tests are actually worse than no tests at all, because you think you're confident, so you're not going to write any tests, and you think you're shipping good stuff, but you're actually not, because people just get lazy and they'll just update the snapshot and they won't review it. Like especially on a pull request where you already have like 500 lines of like code changes, and then you have a couple thousand lines of snapshot changes. Nobody's reading those snapshots. And so, yeah, like I found snapshots to be very easy to overuse and provide little to no value. But my opinion has kind of been, snapshots are great, but make sure that your snapshot is small enough to cover only the thing that actually matters. And when you're doing that, like often what I end up doing is I say, okay, well, the whole output of this component isn't relevant for this test, so I'm gonna like go select for a section of this component that I care about. And I keep on narrowing that down until it's just like I'm snapshotting an H1 or something. And then I realize, oh, wait, I could actually write this as a different assertion altogether. I don't need a snapshot. I just verify that, like go find that H1 and then verify its text content or something. And then from there, like it doesn't, like I don't need a snapshot. So I just use a different assertion. And I've got a blog post about this as well. So I'll paste my link to the blog post here in the chat.
Nice. Yeah, another thing we had in a test that I wrote the other week was it turned out I'd written a test for a component. I'd written a snapshot test for it. Given these props, it matches this snapshot. And one of the big issues for me with snapshots is that the first time you save them, the test output doesn't really show you what's happened. It just says I've saved a snapshot. So if you're not careful, you can save a snapshot that is completely irrelevant, or not irrelevant, more worse, incorrect.
Yeah.
We had a snapshot saved where literally it was like expect blah blah blah, and the snapshot saved was just null because I'd made a mistake in the test.
Yep, I've seen that.
So then I went back to the test a couple of months later maybe, and I was fixing whatever, and then suddenly got this huge output like snapshot was null, and now it's this big div with blah 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 in, and I was like, oh, okay, that's not good.
Yeah.
So snapshots go in a separate file, but that leads to another issue, that they're really invisible to you for large parts of your workflow, which is not good. A new version of Jest, I don't know if it's the most latest, a newer one, has introduced inline snapshots.
Yeah.
Where it will place the content of the snapshot into your test file. I actually love this. Is brilliant in my opinion, because two things. It encourages small snapshots, because you don't want like a 200 line snapshot in your actual test file. That's just a pain. And also it is immediately there in front of you. So you can't do that thing where you snapshot and it ends up being null because you see it. So I think I haven't done this yet, but my opinion is leaning towards inline snapshots. There's an ESLint rule that disables not inline snapshots. I'm quite close to enabling it and just seeing what that does. I'm willing to bet that will lead us to some tests where we get rid of snapshots altogether, some where we replace them with more zoomed in, like specific snapshots that test just the bit we care about. I think that could be an interesting change, because I think to match snapshot and the snapshot going in a different file, like leads to discoverability issues of problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to bring up inline snapshots as well as a good solution for lots of the problems that I have with snapshots. Mostly that like it's really easy to make your snapshot 2,000 lines when it's in a different file, but when it's right there, you're like, oh wow, maybe I should narrow this down.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, completely agree.
So there is one or like two really awesome applications of snapshots that are unrelated to React, and that is in Babel plugins. They're just the best. That like I love using snapshots to, like, I have this serializer that'll say here's the input code, and then a couple of arrows, and here's the output code. And that is my favorite way to test a Babel plugin. So I love snapshots for that. And then because it makes it so you can go look at the the snapshots and know exactly what the Babel plugin does, which is pretty cool. And then CLI output. So like I'll snapshot the help output or whatever else. I've actually snapshotted the file system before on a tool that I had generate a bunch of files. I would go get some stats about the file size and different things. I'd snapshot that. That was pretty interesting. So there are really interesting and useful applications for snapshots. But when we're talking about React and UI, I think we're in agreement. Keeping those small is really important, and using inline snapshots, I think, is generally a good idea as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was writing a code generation tool at the weekend and used Snapshot for that, and it's you say it's great for that kind of thing, but UI less so.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Cool. So what about shallow rendering? Somebody asked earlier about that. What are here? I'll go ahead and explain what shallow rendering is, and then we can talk about it. So when you in React, when you use JSX, that is actually creating an object. If you transpile or compile, I'm going to stop using the word transpile because I guess that Babel doesn't use that word anymore. It's compile. But yeah, so when you compile JSX into JavaScript, it compiles into React.createElement calls. And React Create Element returns an object that doesn't have a ton special about it. There's some information to identify it as a React component. It has a type, it has some props and things like that. And so that object is basically all that shallow rendering does, is it goes to create that object. So you give it the element that you want to render, and it's going to go in and call its render method and get all of the React Create Element, all those objects back. And that's as far as it's going to go. It's not going to call into the render method of the different components that you're rendering. Like it's not going to take the type and call into that render method or whatever. It just gives you that tree of objects. And the value there is it automatically isolates your component from the surrounding components. And so you don't have to really think about it. You just can focus on ensuring that this component renders this other component with these props. And so you can make those assertions really easily. It's also very fast because creating those objects is like just it's not a performance problem at all. And it yeah, that's pretty much the idea. It just isolation and speed. It also works without the DOM, so you don't even need to have like JS DOM loaded into Node or run it in the browser. And yeah, that's shallow rendering. What do you think about that, Jack?
So I'm quite a big fan of shallow rendering for certain classes of test. I think the key thing for me is what you touched on. It's the isolation part of that. I think particularly if I'm writing a component and I'm reusing, say we have a common button that are all across our app that we import. If I'm writing a component that happens to use that common button, I know that the common button component is tested, so I don't feel the need to then mount and run that common button or whatever it's called component in a test for an unrelated component. But that only works for the unit test level where you want that isolation. If we're thinking of these React tests closer to integration tests where you're actually firing up your tree of components and rendering them so you can click around all the different bits, because at that point you literally can't shallow render because it won't render the children. So I find shallow rendering really valuable for stricter isolated unit testing. And often I find that I can achieve quite a lot. I can get quite a lot of confidence just from that. But that kind of with some mounted full rendered tests thrown in as well is the sweet spot for me. Cool.
Yeah. So I differ with that opinion for sure. So I am very, very strongly against shallow rendering. And I think I'm starting to like formulate an understanding of why there are these differing opinions. And so for me, or like, as you said, Jack, you would test the button and then you go and test a component that uses the button, and it doesn't make sense to duplicate that effort. For for me, I would actually just not test the button, and I would just have a single test for all those things that are using the button, because I know that I'm going to cover that button with my other tests. And so unless that button is doing some edge case logic that my other tests aren't going to cover, and if it does have those edge cases, then I will unit test those specific things, and maybe I'll unit test the main case too, because it really isn't like that duplication of effort isn't doesn't bother me as much. And with my philosophy of testing, of ensuring that I'm testing things the way that they'll be when the user is using them, like the user can't mock out the button, or whatever. The user actually wants to interact with the button. The user doesn't care that I'm passing props to the button. Like none of that. It's all implementation detail. And so that's why shallow rendering for me is always the wrong answer, because it will just mock out, and it's basically just a perfect way to test implementation details. So there is value in mocking, and so I will definitely mock some things, like for the router or something, or maybe a CSS transition animation library or something. I don't want to wait for the animation to end before I can click on buttons or whatever. For those things, then I will mock for sure. But mocking is the exception and not the rule. And so that's why I really don't like shallow rendering, because mocking is the only way to go with shallow rendering. That's all it does, is basically, well, it doesn't really mock. It just doesn't use those things. And fundamentally, like from a principle standpoint, I find that tests that are written with shallow rendering wind up in a situation where I can change the implementation, and like it's a refactor, so not changing actual how it works, just changing how it's implemented, and my tests will break, and or I could change, or I could actually break the implementation and my test won't break, and so that is like in opposition to my goals out of a test. And so that's why I never use it. And so I'll use just mocking capabilities if I do want to mock something, but that explicitness in mocking, I think is useful. And yeah, having shallow rendering as a mechanism to mock everything has never been useful to me. And I've got a blog post about that. Of course, I have a blog post about just about everything. So
is there anything you don't have a blog post about, Ken? You're making me look bad.
Well, if there is, then I'll write about it. But yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts there. Do you have any thoughts in response or anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. So on the whole, I think we align, or certainly I agree with all of those points. I think for me, so if the common button is a slightly contrived example, but let's stick with it because at least something we all like. It's a concept we're all familiar with. I think I would only, if I've got another test using that common button, I will only write a shallow rendered test for that other component if I'm confident in the test I have for the common button. I think for me that prevents what you were saying, where you can change the implementation of the common button and not have your tests fail. Because for me, if I change the implementation of the common button, I make a mistake and introduce a bug, I would expect the test that I've written for that component to shout at me and fail quite loudly in that front. And at that point, only then am I confident then mocking it effectively, shallow rendering it in another component. For me, one of the things that's led me towards this is trying to make sure that if I introduce a bug in one component, ideally, and I think this is where we differ, because ideally for me, when I do that, the only test suite that I want to fail is the tests for that common button, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but I don't think I want, if I break the common button, I don't want 10 different React components tests to fail, because then it's going to take me ages to figure out what exactly has changed. So for me, I want to be able to zoom right in on the common button. And I completely agree that there's a trade-off there, because the trade-off there is that you've got tests for other components using the button that are working, even though the button is broken. So I will only make that trade-off if I'm confident in the test covering the button. I think that's kind of how I reason with those trade-offs in my head, because that it's a complete trade-off, and I don't want to make it sound like I think shallow rendering is the answer, and you're entirely wrong, because that's definitely not the case. It's trade-offs in either direction, I think.
Yeah, totally. That is I have seen that be a challenge for my methodology of testing is generally if one thing breaks, many things will break. And that's just kind of the way that integration testing. That's just the story of integration testing. So I have a question about what you said though. So like you mentioned that you kind of rely on the test of the button to make sure or to allow you to shallow render higher level components. My concern would be that a developer later comes in, or I come in later, and I change the button, and then I change the implementation in some way, and I notice, oh, the button tests are broken. So I go update the button tests, and I go around the app and update usages, but I miss a couple, and I don't have any tests to make sure that I catch every single one of those. And so I guess that's less of a question. I don't. Your answer will be something like, yeah, that is a trade-off. Like, yeah. So yeah, it really, like, it does come down to trade-offs. So like, I'm more concerned about like, I don't mind having 3 or 4 or maybe even a dozen tests fail if it means that I can make sure that I address every single one of those use cases in exchange for and you're right, it can be a challenge to identify, okay, I've got 12 test failures. Where is the actual problem? And normally in those kinds of situations, there is only one place that you need to fix, like one line of code or whatever, and all of the tests will succeed. And so you do have to come up with strategies for identifying where the failure is. But I would rather have that struggle than think that all my use cases are met and ship code that's actually broken. And so it kind of comes back to my philosophy of just being confident that I can ship my code. And I think that's kind of unfair to say it that way. Like I'm sure that you also are very interested in being confident. It's just how we get there. It's a little different.
Yeah, I think, like you say, exactly what I'm going to say. That is completely the trade-off. I think often what we'll do is have primarily shallow tests, but we might have say we'd fallen foul of that at some place, we'd broken a component because of shallow rendering. We might then have introduced one test that didn't use shallow rendering that covered that full, more like an integration test at that point, I guess you could argue. So I think we will introduce those as and when we need them, when we find issues or find areas that we ship this code, all the tests pass, we're confident about it, and then just saw the dog come in, and then and then if we ship it and there's a bug in production, one of the first things we like to figure out when there's a bug in production is, okay, how did that bug get there? Like, what level are we not? We were confident in our tests. Obviously, we've got a hole somewhere that we need to plug. Is a shallow rendered unit test enough? If so, we'd probably go for that one. Is a mounted unit test or integration test enough? Great, we'll go for that. Or maybe we do need a Cypress-y end-to-end acceptance test. I don't know. So I think my approach, for some of the reasons, I think shallow rendering is simpler. The tests are normally a little bit cleaner because you've got you've got a smaller tree to work with. So I think I tend to go for that for default, but be very willing to fill holes and gaps with mounted tests when I'm not getting the confidence I want from the shallow tests.
Yeah. Maybe the tests are harder for you when you're mounting because you're using Enzyme.
Well, that could be it. I've heard there's this other library, which I yet to find the time to look into. That could possibly, yeah, I do actually, I really like Enzyme. It made testing in React about 1 million times easier. I can still remember working with React test utils. Is that the library?
Yeah.
Which is this massive, long, complicated API that I never really understood. And Enzyme was great for me and shallow rendering. I would like to explore using Enzyme solely for shallow rendering and looking at React testing library for mounted tests, but I haven't. Again, it's on my big list of things that I don't have enough time to look at.
Yeah. So actually, I'll just mention React testing library a little bit for people who are interested in checking it out. So Enzyme, it is a very full featured testing utility for React. And in my opinion, it's too fully featured. It has too many features. Things like being able to get the component instance and call methods on it. And that actually is the encouraged way for testing event handlers, as far as what I see in the docs and in issues, from comments from maintainers and things, is test the on-change handler by calling the instance method. I think that's a huge mistake. And I think, Jack, like you generally would move lots of all the logic into separate like JavaScript modules anyway, if there's anything complex enough to test in there. So, but yeah, I'm very strongly against getting component instances and calling methods on those. But Enzyme allows and encourages that. Also, like shallow rendering in general, as we talked about, and Enzyme allows and encourages that as well. And then traversing the DOM using CSS selectors and getting elements by their component name, which I'm very strongly against. Like, I changed my component name and now my tests are breaking. Like, are you kidding me? That there's nothing that the user cares less about than what your components are called. And so like there's just a lot of features that are handy for us as testers, but encourage poor testing practices. And so that's why I created React Testing Library, because it encourages testing components in the way that the user would use your component. So if you have a form that's like your login form, username, password, the Enzyme would say, okay, go find your inputs and then fill in the first input with the username, the second input with the password, and then submit the form, call the submit handler. In React Testing Library, the way you do this is you render your component, you find the form that's labeled username, or you find the input that's labeled username, you find the input that's labeled password, and you fill in the username and password, and then you find the button that, or it doesn't even have to be a button, just find the thing that has the text submit in it, and click on that. And that's exactly what you would tell a user. If you hired somebody today and said, hey, go test this manually, that's what you would tell them to do. And so that's what the test, that's how the tests are written. That's the whole idea of React Testing Library. So people can go check that out if they want to. Yeah, so we've got a couple more questions. Jack, was there anything else you wanted to touch on this before we take a look at some more questions?
No, just very briefly, I think a lot of things you mentioned about Enzyme I completely agree with. I would say that I would personally never. Enzyme also allows you to test events by simulating them, which is in my opinion vastly superior for the same reasons you just talked about. And so I think the issue I have with Enzyme, and I think we share, is that it gives you a lot of tools, and some of those tools are good. And if you could just use a very small subset of Enzyme, and it would probably align very much with your philosophy, Kent. But the issue is you have to know which of those tools are good and bad. Again, like Enzyme also lets you reach into a component to read its state. And so in theory, you could reach into its instance, simulate an event by calling a function, and then check its internal state, which for the same reasons as you, I would never do, because I'm not testing what the user would see there. So I think the power Enzyme gives you can be good. And there have been admittedly incredibly rare occasions where I found one of its obscure methods vaguely useful to test some very awkward thing. But on the whole, I think our approach is probably quite similar, and I'd be willing to bet that I could quite easily move my tests from Enzyme to React Testing Library with not too much friction because of that. So yeah, I think people learning Enzyme just have to be very wary of the approach or how they use Enzyme.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you brought that up. That is a good point. And for a very long time, like I've always felt generally this way about testing, even before I created React Testing Library, and when I was using Enzyme. And so yeah, it was just like you say, used a subset of Enzyme features. And the reason that I created React Testing Library was I was creating a testing workshop, and I was getting to the part where I was going to teach people Enzyme. And I started creating a list of all of the things in Enzyme that you should never, ever do. And I thought, this is just kind of silly. Like, I'd much rather that I don't have to tell them these things and like just use this tool. So that's kind of where React Testing Library came from. But yeah, and there are definitely, I have a couple of situations where Enzyme would be nice. Like there's one test in Downshift, for example, that does actually need to get the downshift instance to verify some state that's not exposed, just for a very weird edge case thing. So there, and that actually does use React Testing Library. It just has to do a couple extra things to make that work, because the React Testing Library won't let you do that by itself. But yeah, cool. So I've got to scroll up here a bit. We missed a couple of things. Further up, somebody, it was Josh, asked, what kinds and sizes of React apps do you tend to work on? I'm curious if the nature of the app might affect your experience with different testing approaches. So for me, I work on various, mostly 2 applications at PayPal. And actually recently I've been doing more platform type work and less application stuff. And then I also do plenty of a lot of open source components as well. And so these smaller components. And so lots of my, and so the size of the application, I would say it's a little bigger than medium size. Yeah, maybe quite a bit bigger. I wouldn't say it's large, but it's, yeah, they're both, one of them is quite big and the other one is maybe a little medium rare. I don't know. smaller than medium, I guess. And for me, the size of the application doesn't, or even the size of the component doesn't impact the way that I test it. Maybe if it's it's more what the component or what the needs of the application are. So in a smaller application, or sorry, in a smaller component, I generally won't use something like Cypress. But in Downshift, it's a single component, but I am using Cypress because there are some complex user interactions with browser APIs and things that I want to make sure are working. And so, yeah, for me, it's more the type of use cases I need to support than the size of the component or application I'm writing. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, I think the same. In terms of application, my previous company was a fairly large single page React application. The current company, we're effectively migrating from lots of jQuery and kind of scattered bits and bobs into a cohesive React currently app. And so that's kind of different. That's more a suite of components rather than one big, large app. But I would agree with you that I don't think it really matters. I think my philosophy stays relatively similar. One thing I meant to say earlier, I'll mention now, is it's also worth noting that for very small components, I might not even test them at all. I think you can definitely fall into a trap, particularly with snapshot testing. Just thinking, oh, I'll just write a test here because I might as well. And often I won't if it's a very, very small component, maybe even a button to contrive my earlier contrived common button. But let's imagine that common button was a very complex button. But yeah, I don't think size of application would affect too much how I think about it, to be honest.
Cool. Great. Wow, we've got a couple more questions coming in. So, and Josh is helping people and answering some questions too. But so Lokendra mentioned that they're using Enzyme and snapshot testing using wrapper.debug to do the snapshot. I would recommend you look into mount to JSON for Enzyme. It's a snapshot serializer that will do that for you, or you could do yeah, that's what I'd.
Yeah, I was going to recommend one that sounds very similar called Enzyme to JSON.
Oh, maybe that's what it is.
Which might be that. I'll put a link in. But we've used this, so we don't use the React create test renderer and create a thing that you call to JSON on and pass that into a snapshot. I always forget to call to JSON and it never goes well. I love Enzyme to JSON because you can just give it a mount component to match this snapshot and it just works. So I'd highly recommend using that. I've just put a link. Oh, remove any web addresses and try again.
Oh no, dang it. Okay. I'll look for it.
Google
I think
Enzyme to JSON.
One other thing to consider, and this is what I do in React Testing Library. You can use snapshots because React Testing Library doesn't give you a wrapper like Enzyme does. It just gives you a couple, like an object and a couple useful methods. You can actually snapshot DOM nodes, and Jest has built in the capability of formatting that nicely. And so if you wanted to, I think you could do wrapper.first.hostNodes or something like that, .instance. It's kind of weird to get the DOM node, the root DOM node. and then you could snapshot that. I probably wouldn't do that. But the reason that I don't like using enzyme to JSON is the snapshot will include a whole bunch of implementation details, like the component names, the prop names, what the name of the function is for the props and stuff like that. And none of those things, like the user cares nothing about what those things are called. And so when you snapshot a mounted component like that, you're just opting yourself in for having your snapshots break anytime you make any change ever, which will train your finger to hit the U key to update the snapshot, and it'll train your reviewers to never review. So I would really highly discourage snapshotting mounted components like that. You either snapshot the DOM node or snapshot the a rendered component in Enzyme, because that'll just be the string of HTML. But anyway, there's that. Did you have any comments about that, Jack?
No. Last time I looked, I don't think enzyme to JSON includes the function name. I think it just says function. Maybe I've misremembered that, which avoids some of that. But I have totally come across that issue before. Yeah,
having the component names is enough for me. I feel like I have seen if the function has a name, but maybe they
may well have. I don't know. I couldn't say if we're on the latest and greatest version of any. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. But I agree in principle. I just can't remember that specific example works or not. I don't know. I'm such a bad developer, honestly. So I don't really know.
No, you're good, Jack. All right, let's see if we've got any other questions in here, and maybe we should get close to wrapping up. It's been almost an hour, so okay. So Luis is asking for up-to-date material on testing React. So I know you've got some. I'll mention mine. So I do have that course on front-end masters. That is 90%, 99% current. React testing library had a couple of small changes, like it no longer has render into document, and it's just render now. So like everything that you'll learn in there will be relevant and current. And I'm also in the process of working on a very large testing course that's mostly focused on React, but a lot of just general testing stuff. And I can't give you a date on that because I have a full-time job, and so it's all on the side. But yeah, so that's it for me. What do you have, Jack?
I released a video course in February-ish called Testing React with Enzyme Ingest. So it is pretty much up to date still. There have been a couple of small API changes to a couple of the libraries, but not enough to really throw you off. Maybe I'll ask Kent to put a link in because it won't let me.
What is it again?
Can I send it in our Hangout to you?
Oh yeah, you can send it in a chat. No,
there we go. Yeah, it's
cool,
there.
Perfect.
So it is mostly up to date. Shameless plug. There will be new videos coming soon into that, which bring a couple more things up to date and talk about a couple of new things as well. So that should be coming reasonably soon. He says having not recorded any of them, but they're on the way. So that should be updated quite soon. I think also I'll put a discount code into the Slack. I think Friends of Kent should still work and maybe get you a small discount. If it doesn't, tweet me and I'll fix it.
Perfect.
But yeah, that kind of sums up my whole testing strategy and approach in terms of unit/integration tests with React, and talks a bit about testing like Redux components and forms and slightly more complicated things too. Oh, and the first 5 videos, are entirely free on YouTube. So if you go to the link that Kent shared, you don't have to buy any of it. The first 5 are on YouTube, entirely free. So just go ahead and watch those if you're interested.
Cool. So I should add also that Level Up Tuts from Scott. Oh goodness, what's his last name? I can't remember his last name. It's a hard name to say. That's all I remember. But he also just published a new course called React Testing for Beginners. I watched a lot of it, and it's superb, and it uses React Testing Library too. So I recommend it. Let's see. Dodds course. Here's a link for that. And there was something else I was going to mention. Oh yeah, so somebody asked me about my course if it's going to be on Egghead. It will probably be on Egghead. It's kind of, we're trying something new, and I can't tell you too much about it, but your Egghead subscription might get it for you. I think it will. I'm not sure. We're still unsure about that. So just if you follow me on Twitter and subscribe to my newsletter, then and I'll paste a link to that too. Then you'll be made aware of it. Don't worry. I will scream it from the rooftops when it's finally published. So
yeah, whenever I release a course, I just retweet it endlessly every hour.
Yep.
I think my followers hate me, but yeah.
The ones who hate you are not your audience, so it's okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Cool. Let me make sure we got everything else, and then we can wrap up with like last things. So one person is asking, what about a tooltip component that could say render above or below a component using CSS controlled by prop? Can you explain how to walk through testing this usage in each of your approaches? So I'm assuming they're talking about like CSS controlled capabilities, and you apply different class names or different CSS based off of props or whatever. So for me, I probably wouldn't test this because it'd be too hard. You could snapshot, and there, like if you're using a CSS and JS library, then you can snapshot the component, use a serializer that will include the CSS in the snapshot. There are also some utilities for checking which class names are being applied. There's this utility called just DOM that can allow you to make assertions on DOM nodes, so you can verify some certain styles are being applied and things. Yeah, like I think the best way to test this would be using a visual regression testing tool, but that is like a whole bigger story. If you really want to get into that, I think my current favorite, not from using but from like investigating, is called Applet Tools, and it looks really cool. But yeah, so what do you think about that, Jack?
Yeah, I think I'm the same. The only thing I guess you could consider testing is if it gets given the prop A, it gets these class names. If it gets the prop B, it gets given these class names. At that point, for me, it would depend on how important that functionality that it's changing is. I would probably lean towards not testing it. But if it's like this is, again, I'm an expert on contrived examples. But if it's like if it doesn't get this class name, your whole application breaks. Then sure, I'd probably test that. But if it doesn't get this class name, it will display in red instead of blue. That feels not worth writing a test, because tests aren't free, and every time you write a test, that's another thing that could break or go wrong. It's more lines of code, so they have to pay back in terms of what they offer. And I don't think a test like that would. I can imagine you write that test, you give it prop A, it has classes X, Y, and Z. Then one day you rename a class, and you have to go through and like fix loads of tests, and that doesn't feel productive to me.
Yep. That's good enough, I would say too. Cool. So we've got another question directed to me, I think. Is there a way to reuse the test code using React Testing Library? I think, actually, I'm not sure I understand this question. So if you're asking about reuse the test, yeah, sorry. I thought I understood it, and then I read it again, and now I don't. So feel free to ping me on Twitter, and Jack, I'm sure, is happy to answer questions on Twitter for anybody who has questions. So why don't well, let's both go ahead and actually, you know what, I'm the only one who can paste links. I'm going to paste a link to your Twitter here, and wait, it's Jack_Franklin.
Yes, it is.
Okay, let me make sure I get to the right one. People following
that haunts me, that underscore.
Yeah. And let me get mine in here too. And feel free to ping either one of us on Twitter, and we're happy to answer any other questions that you have.
Yep. Nice.
Cool. This was fun, Jack. Thanks so much.
This was great. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was awesome. I just love like how much the front end community is talking about testing compared to like I was a back end developer 3-4 years ago, and really the front end community just sort of shunned all that testing stuff. And it's great now that there's so many libraries and so many chats and so many ways we can do it. So I think it's like regardless of philosophy, like some tests are nearly always better than no tests. And so it's great that we're having these chats, and, there are so many options available now. So yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that question asker, Yoshihiro, just clarified their question. So I'll answer it really quick. So I want to reuse the test code because one test can be the recondition of another test case, like a test for fetching data can be a precondition of many following tests. So I think that I understand what this is talking about. And this is not specific to React testing library. This is like any testing in general. There are utilities built into Jest for doing stuff like this called before each. I generally don't like that utility. I find that winds up with shared state and things like that. So what I generally will do is I'll have a setup function that I call at the beginning of my test that I'll set up all those preconditions if I'm going to be using that in multiple places. And then I just call that anywhere I need it. Do you have any thoughts, Jack?
Yeah, I agree. There are times where before each is useful. If you want to do something like reset all your mocks or stubs or something before every test, then that's great. I think you have to be very careful. You can very quickly put loads of data and state in your before each, and then it becomes very hard to figure out when you're looking at an individual test, like, where is this data coming from? Is it from before each? Is it from somewhere else? And generally, I think I think you should be able to look at any individual test on isolation and see where all the data is coming from, and see the setup step, the invocation, and the assertion. And before each easily can mean that you can't see that. So you should be very wary of putting lots of logic in before each. As a setup function is really a great way to go there. And also, I'm not sure if this person was asking about this, but it's also very important that your tests aren't order dependent as well. So another reason to not use a before each or anything that could mutate state in a before each or something. Like, you should be able to run your tests in any order. And a lot of test frameworks do randomize them and have them pass. So I think before each can get you into problems. If used correctly, it's a great tool, but again, can give you issues.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that made me think of another blog post that I wrote pretty recently called about test isolation in React. So I'll paste a link to that as well. You want to be order independent and existence independent. I've had some tests where like we skipped a test and then other tests start breaking. And that's definitely not a situation that you want to be in.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of test frameworks will let you only run one test as well. Like Jest lets you do it or it.only. And that's really useful if this one test is failing and you want to like just run that. It's really useful. But I've had it before where I've had a failing test, made it be the only one running, and then it starts passing. And then you have to go and debug like why it's passing because another test is causing issues. So yeah, that's a real issue. So making sure every test can be run on its own is really important.
Yep. Cool. There's some bonus material for you all. All right. Now I'm really going to stop the broadcast. It was fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Bye-bye.
See ya.